All right, Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wa salatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa wala. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. Welcome to our final discussion in regards to this book, our not the final Wednesday class. Um, so for today's weekly Embrace Wednesday discussion, we will be finishing up the book that we have been going over for the past few months, titled Evolution of Fiqh by Dr. Bilal Phillips. Alhamdulillah, this has been quite an amazing ride. I really enjoyed learning more about the history of fiqh and the madahib with all of you. But tonight will be the end of this journey and the start of a new one, inshallah ta'ala. So tonight we're going to be going over the last two chapters, which is titled Differences Among the Ummah, which is section 10, and then the conclusion. After that, we're going to do something a little bit different because at the end of this book, Dr. Bilal essentially makes a call to action for where he feels the Ummah and um, the community of Islamic scholars should go in regards to the four schools of thought and in terms of fiqh. And I wanted to kind of have a discussion with all of you in regards to what he's saying, what's your perspective on it, what's your opinion on all these concepts that he's mentioned. But I want to be able to have this discussion offline, aka not through the Facebook Live, so that way everyone feels open to share their thoughts and perspectives. So what we're going to do is after we finish going over these two chapters, I'm going to end the live stream. We're going to keep the Zoom meeting open, and then we'll go into the discussion portion of the segment, in which I will be asking you guys what are your thoughts on the call to action that Dr. Phillips details within these last two chapters, which inshallah we'll be going over. Now, for those of you who are watching through Facebook, what we can do is the we can post in the Facebook chat the Zoom link, and I'm doing that right now. And you please feel free to join us through Zoom after we end the live stream, so that if you want to participate within the discussion portion of today's program. So I'm just going to real quickly post this in the chat, the Zoom link. All right. So I posted it in there. The Zoom link is in the Facebook Live chat. For those of you who want to join us for the discussion through live, please do click on that and join us through Zoom so that way you can participate in the actual discussion. And with that, let's go ahead and jump right into it. So in these last two sections, the purpose of these last two sections for Dr. Bilal Phillips is to make a case for his call to action at the end, which is essentially a unification of the four major schools of thought, a call for the halt of the way he describes as sectarianism between the four madhabs. You know, he's calling to stop this particular method of approaching fiqh in the four schools of thought, and to unify all the four schools of thought through one madhab and dynamic fiqh, which inshallah ta'ala will go into detail once we get to that chapter. But before we go into the conclusion, he starts section 10 with really just kind of refuting one main argument in regards as to how there are some individuals who say that the Prophet ﷺ, predicted or foresaw the schools of thought and promoted it, right? And he basically, in this chapter, he tries to refute these claims. So he references four different four different hadith in which those who promote the what he calls sectarianism of the different schools of thought, hence usually like to quote in regards to why they think it's good to have um, these good to have four very separate schools of thought. And the hadiths that he references are thus. One is disagreement among my nation is a mercy, is one hadith that is mentioned by the proponents of what he calls sectarianism. The second one is differences among my companions are a mercy for you. The third one is my companions are like stars. You will be guided by whichever of them you follow. And the D is verily my companions are like stars. You'll be guided by statements of theirs you adopt. And what Dr. Bilal says in this chapter is what he says what the problem with these hadith that we have just quoted are is hadith A has virtually no chain of narration. It's not really connected to anybody. So he says it can't even be called a proper hadith. Um, the other three are either very, very weak, or they have been shown to be fabricated or batil false. So according to Dr. Bernard Phillips, those hadith that some proponents of having this sectarianism between the four major schools of thought, the evidence that they have is not sufficient. I do ask everyone who comes in to please do mute your mics, inshallah time. And from there, Dr. Bilal Phillips starts discussing as to why he feels it's not good to have this idea of sectarianism between the four schools of thought. So he discusses the differences amongst the companions and how they would approach their differences, or they had differences of opinion, which we have discussed in previous sections and previous classes. He cites one particular event or incident in which Omar bin Khattab approached two Sahabi who were having a disagreement, right? Essentially, they were having a disagreement in regards to whether or not a single piece of cloth was enough in order to be considered properly prepared for the salat, being properly covered. They were having this disagreement. And essentially, Omar bin Khattab approached them and reprimanded both of them. He reprimanded both of them, saying, "Okay, this is the one that is correct," and he reprimanded them for basically having this intense disagreement due to the fact that it was causing the way that he quotes him as saying, have two of Allah's messenger's companions disagreed, and they are among those whom the masses watch closely and imitate. Ubay is correct, and Ibn Mas'ud should desist. If I hear anyone disputing about this matter after this point, I will deal with him. As most of us know, Umar bin Khattab was a very tough guy, right? And he was someone where if he saw something wrong, he was very he was very strict in handling and making sure it was taken care of. And so the reason that Dr. Bilal Phillips mentions this particular incident is to highlight to the reader that what was most important for the companions was to be unified. And if they had differences of opinion regarding to something that is correct, something that was incorrect, it was important for them to not uphold their opinion, but instead uphold for what is true, and to avoid having too many disagreements, mainly due to the fact that it would cause dissension among the Ummah. And based off our discussion of previous chapters, during the times of the rightly guided caliphs, we saw that the companions and the four rightly guided caliphs, the Rashidin, the Khalifa, they would come together, have a discussion, and reach a consensus. And it was very important for them to have consensus for the rest of the Ummah to follow. And throughout the remaining chapter, he just discusses some of the founders of the madhabs like Imam Malik, Imam Shafi'i, and others in regards to their feelings towards following the opinion of even a companion without proper evidence. So I'm sorry, excuse me, I'm sorry. So he quotes Imam Malik, who was asked if it was safe to follow a ruling related to him by another narrator who heard it from companions of the Prophet. And Imam Malik replied, "No, by Allah, not unless it is correct. The truth is only one. Can two opposing opinions be simultaneously correct? The opinion which is correct can be only one." And the reason that Dr. Bilal Phillips highlights that particular point is his argument is not all the four schools of thought, according to Dr. Bilal Phillips, cannot be infallible. They cannot, not every single opinion within all the schools of thought can be completely correct due to the fact that there are conflicting rulings in between all of the schools of thought. Thus, he is saying that scholars and Muslims should not approach the schools of thought and treat them as if they are all completely infallible, and that one is religiously obligated to follow a particular madhab to a T. And he highlights within this chapter some practices that you don't see too much today, in my particular opinion, but you do see this in earlier years of Islam, and even to a certain extent today, where Muslims are told they have to follow one of the madhabs, and they're not allowed to change their madhabs, and they have to basically, if they're not following one of the madhabs, then they are off on the wrong path. Dr. Bilal Phillips disagrees with this particular method, and he's making these particular points throughout this chapter in order to make his case, right? So we just finished the second to last chapter. Now we're going to go into, inshallah ta'ala, and go into the conclusion. So within the last chapter, Dr. Bilal Phillips was making his case and making it clear that he disagreed with the mentality and the approach of treating all the four schools of thought as completely infallible, and that one is absolutely required to follow one of those schools of thoughts to a T, and you cannot switch. Basically, he's calling for stopping this practice of approaching a madhab with basically this rigidity of how Muslims approach the madhabs, the four schools of thought. And this last chapter is focused on Dr. Bilal Phillips making a case for another way of approaching fiqh and the schools of thought, which inshallah we will go into next. So essentially, after debunking or after making it clear to the reader that he disagrees with, we are reading Evolution of Fiqh from Dr. Bilal Phillips, and we are actually finishing up this book. So you joined us right at the end there, brother. So this is from Dr. Bilal Phillips, Evolution of Fiqh. This is a book that essentially goes over the history of fiqh, how the schools of thought developed, and the different contributions of the founders of schools of thought throughout Islamic history, how they contributed to the overall development of fiqh being, of course, Islamic jurisprudence. So I hope that answered your question, brother. So after Dr. Bilal Phillips calls for no longer treating all the four schools of thought as infallible and treating them with this rigidness where one is required to follow one particular school of thought only to a T, and there can be no flexibility. He now ends his book with a new call to action. And this call to action he's calling for are essentially two things. One, calling for the practice of what he calls dynamic fiqh, which he describes as treating fiqh with a lot of flexibility. The same type of flexibility that was practiced by the earlier scholars who were the founders of many of the schools of thought, which we went over, like Abu Hanifa, Imam Shafi'i, Hanbal, and others. So he calls for the scholars to revive this practice of what he calls dynamic fiqh, in which instead of focusing on, okay, what a particular imam of the madhab said, focus more on the evidence behind it and approach these schools of thought from a more objective standpoint. And so that's number one. He calls for the scholars to practice dynamic fiqh, a more flexible fiqh similar to the practices of earlier scholars. And next, he calls for, and this is what I found pretty interesting. This is where I think, after we finish the live stream, this is where I want to really have a discussion with all of you. He calls for a unification of the madhab. Basically, instead of having what he's calling for, and that's why I found this pretty interesting, he's calling for in this book at the end, instead of having four distinct schools of thought that are all said to be completely infallible and one has to be on one particular school of thought, he's calling for the unification of the schools of thought to where instead of having four, it's just basically one with a variety of different scholars from different backgrounds who analyze varying sources from each of the standing methods. He offers some proposals on how to actually do this. One of the proposals that he makes, and of course, again, this is mainly for those who are actually scholars. He's not calling for everyone to do this because we've already made it very clear before that not everyone can actively practice fiqh. You have to be a scholar, someone of knowledge, someone who is at that level, just like with any profession, right? So he's not calling for universal dynamic fiqh. He's calling for the scholars of today to initiate this practice. And he offers some proposals to do so. One proposal is for a group of these scholars from around the world to essentially critically and objectively analyze this resources from all the schools of thought and their rulings, their principles based off those rulings, and see which of these different rulings and principles most closely abide to the strict principles of the Sharia, which of course is the Quran and the Sunnah. And he makes it clear that of course he knows that what he's calling for is something that's not going to be easy. It's going to require individuals who are very intelligent, who are very dynamic, who are very flexible, a very special group of people to do this. But this is what he feels should be the step for Islamic scholarship today. To move forward from having four separate distinct schools of thought and start working towards having one flexible school of thought. And that's where the chapter ends. And so from here, I want to go ahead and move on to the discussion portion, right? Because the call to action that Dr. Blau Phillips notes in his conclusion, I found to be pretty interesting. So what we're going to do is we're going to end the Facebook live stream. Those of you who are watching Facebook Live right now, who wants to join in on the conversation again, I do have the Zoom link posted in the Facebook chat. Please go ahead and click on that now, because now what we're going to do is we're going to stop the live stream, open the floor, and start having a discussion on what is everyone's thoughts in regards to Dr. Bilal Phillips' call to action, which again is, instead of having four distinct madhabs, calling for one unified madhab that is flexible and dynamic. And on your thoughts of the book in general. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the live stream. Those of you who are tuning in via Facebook, thank you for joining us. Assalamu alaikum. Please do click the Zoom link to continue the